I'm going to read another poem. The next poem is called There Was a Bad Tree. There was a bad tree, the people hated. The leaves gave off a foul smell, and the flowers had a bitter stink. If you got too close, you vomited. The fruit was poison. One bite and you were dead. Everyone really disliked it. The bad tree stunk. They talked endlessly about it and decided to cut it down, get rid of it. They chopped with axes and barely made a dent. Wearing breathing masks, they whacked at it and nibbled and chipped. Oily powder from the shiny dark green leaves got on their skin, blistered, and they scratched bloody red. They put on protective gear with oxygen and went at it with electric buzzsaws and heavy equipment. Working 24-hour shifts, finally they cut it down. Everybody was really happy and celebrated the great victory, a noble deed well done, and they went to bed exhausted. The next morning, the bad tree had grown back, had sprung up, new and bigger and more beautiful and ugly. It was very depressing. They talked a lot about it and cut it down again and poured gasoline on the roots and burned all the leaves and branches in a big fire. After the smoldering embers got cold, the tree grew back, bigger, more bad, and really gorgeous. Other people had been watching from their houses, waiting their turn. They thought themselves smarter, with higher intellectual capabilities. They knew how to get rid of the tree. It was a growing plant, a wood tree that grew in the earth. They incinerated it, burned the roots with chemicals, vaporizing acids, and robotic lasers, detonated on the ground, bombed from the air, hit with smart missiles, and bombarded with radiation. They made a firestorm and covered the ground with concrete and steel. The tree grew back, more fresh, more elegant, even gracious, and really ugly. The wood was harder, darker, thick, hot muscle, and the leaves, full and lush, moved like underwater plants luxuriously in the breeze. It was extremely depressing, extremely discouraging, a catastrophe. They had made for themselves a hell world. They talked endlessly about it and came to a big decision. The mayor resigned in disgrace, and those who had worked so hard left, humiliated, departed, moved to the other side of town, stayed away. Then, out of the blue, appeared these beautiful people. They were simple and humble and a little like peacocks and seemingly well-intentioned with a great sense of humor. Radiantly relaxed, oozing loving kindness and compassion, they walked right up and started eating the leaves. They ate the leaves and enjoyed them, became happy, and laughed and chomped on more leaves. You could tell they really liked the taste. They pressed their cheeks to the flowers, black velvet coated with transmission oil. They licked the sweet juices that seeped from the petals. The pollen was coal dust and petroleum gas. Burying their noses, they sucked in deep breaths, eating the smell. Great bliss. They discovered the fruit hidden beneath the leaves, overripe mangoes with sticky eggplant skin hung like testicles. And inside the fruit is rotting meat like liver. The special people got their faces into the stinking slime and really got into it, inhaling with their lips and teeth and tongues. They licked and drank the thick red juice. The seeds, like cabochon rubies, seemed particularly potent and were chewed with great delight. The fruit contained the 5 wisdoms. The men and women became luminous. Their skin was golden, and their bodies, almost transparent, were clothed in shimmering rainbow lights. They became sleepy, yawned, and curled up under the tree and took a nap. While they slept, music filled the air. Lounging against the gnarled tree trunk and protruding roots, their huge bodies, colored red, yellow, blue, green, white, rested in great equanimity and radiated huge compassion. At the root endings, there were jewels, diamonds and emeralds and rubies, which were stars in the sky of the world below. The beautiful men and women woke up and nibbled on the leaves again. They ate the leaves like deer, pausing between bites, looking up at the vast, empty sky. The leaves and fruit increased their clarity and bliss and introduced the nature of primordially pure wisdom mind. I've just finished a new poem that I was working on for a year and a half, and I read it for the first time in New York 10 days ago at PS1. So this is the second time I'm going to be reading it, and it's called God is Man-Made. Yes, there is a God, and it is made by man. There is a God, and it is man-made. All the gods are made by you and me. We create the gods, and they look like us. Yes, there was a moment recognizing intuitively the empty, true nature of mind, beyond concepts and inconceivable, and then we began thinking about it, made it into ideas, made it into religions, invented all the self-serving religions. And then we said some words and said it was the word of God, words from God. And everybody believed it, wanted to believe it. We created God, and he looks like us. Yes, there is no hell. There are no hell worlds of devils and demons other than the hell inside my mind, the hell inside my mind, the hell inside your mind, the hell you and I create around us, the hell we create around us, the hell we create around us, and take with us into death. Yes, there is no heaven. There are no heaven worlds other than the joy of you. Heaven is living in your eyes, living in your eyes, living in your eyes, and seeing everybody in the world as gods and goddesses. Every wretched, grasping, ugly person is a deity swimming in light. Yes, at the moment of death, at the instant of awareness, the gods vanish. If you go looking for heaven, you are in trouble. The gods vanish within the unborn, empty nature of mind. You are liberated through your own self-luminous awareness. Your own self-luminous awareness will always be with you. I will always be with you. I will always be with you. I will always be with you. Yes, everything is delusion, including the most sacred. Everything is delusion, including the most profound wisdom. Yes, everything is delusion, including the highest, most precious teachings, which lead to the realization that everything is delusion. The play of emptiness and bliss. Finding it through yourself, finding it through yourself, finding it through yourself, finding it through yourself. Self-luminous awareness ceaselessly coming. Thank you. I'm going to do one more poem, and it's called Thanks for Nothing. And I started writing it on my 70th birthday in December of 2006. Thanks for nothing on my 70th birthday. I would like to give my thanks to everyone for everything. And as a token of my appreciation, I would like to offer back to you all my good and bad habits as magnificent, priceless jewels, wish-fulfilling gems, satisfying your every need and want. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thanks. May every drug I ever took come back and get you high. May every glass of wine and vodka I ever drank come back and make you feel really good, numbing your nerve ends, allowing the natural clarity of your mind to flow free. May all the suicides be songs of aspiration. Thanks that bad news is always true. May all the chocolate I've ever eaten come back rushing through your bloodstream and make you feel happy. Thanks for allowing me to be a poet, a noble effort doomed but the only choice. I want to thank you for your kindness and praise. Thanks for celebrating me. Thanks for the resounding applause. Thanks for taking everything for yourself and giving nothing back. You were always only self-serving. Thanks for exploiting my big ego and making me a star for your own benefit. Thanks that you never paid me. Thanks for all the sleaze. Thanks for being mean and rude and smiling at my face. I am happy that you robbed me. I am happy that you lied. I am happy that you helped me. Grazie. Merci beaucoup. May you smoke a joint with William and spend some intimate time with his mind, more profound than any book he wrote. I give enormous thanks to all my lovers, beautiful men with brilliant minds, great artists, Bob, Jasper, Ugo. May they come here and make love to you. And may my many other lovers of totally great sex, countless lovers of boundless, fabulous sex, countless lovers of boundless, fabulous sex, countless lovers of boundless, fabulous sex, in the golden age of promiscuity, may they all come here and make love to you, if you want. May they hold you in their arms, bawl into your heart's delight, bawl into your heart's delight, bawl into your heart's delight. May all the people who are dead, Alan, Brian, Cookie, Jack, and I do not miss any of you. I don't miss any of them. No nostalgia. It was wonderful that we loved each other, but I do not want any of them back. Now, if any of you are attracted to any of them, may they come back from the dead and do whatever is your pleasure. May they multiply and be the slaves of whomever wants them, satisfying your every wish and desire. But you won't want them as masters, as their demons. May Andy come here, fall in love with you, and make each of you a superstar. Everyone can have Andy, everyone can have Andy, everyone can have Andy, everyone can have an Andy. Huge hugs to my friends who betrayed me. Every friend became an enemy sooner or later. Deep kisses to my loves that failed. I am delighted you are vacuum cleaners sucking everything into your dirt bag. You are none other than a reflection of my mind. Thanks for the depression problem and feeling like suicide every day of my life. And now that I'm 77, I'm happily almost there. 20 billion years ago, in the primordial wisdom soup, beyond concept and incomprehensible, something without substance moved slightly and became something imperceptible, moved again and became invisible, moved again and became a particle, and particles moved again and became a quark, and again and became quarks, moved again and became protons and neutrons, and the 12 dimensions of space. Tiny fireballs of primordial energy, bits tossed back and forth in a game of catch between particles, transmitting electromagnetic light and going really fast, 40 million times a second, where the pebble hits the water. This is where the trouble began. Something without substance became something with substance. Why did this happen? Because something substanceless had a feeling of missing out on something, not getting it, not getting something when there was nothing to have. From that primordially endless potential to modern day reality, 20 billion years later, has produced me, and my stupid, grasping mind has made me and you and my grasping mind. May Rinpoche and all the great Tibetan teachers who loved me come back and love you more. May they hold you in their wisdom hearts, bathe you in all pervasive compassion, give you pith instructions, and may you, with the diligence of Olympic athletes, do meditation practice, and may you, with great confidence, realize the true nature of mind. America, thanks for the neglect. I did it without you. Let us celebrate poetic justice. You and I never were, never tried to do anything, and never succeeded. Thanks for introducing me to the face of the naked mind. Thanks for nothing.
So I think I was going to start in a different place, but after listening to those 4 poems, I think I was quite struck by the different kinds of literary forms that were flowing through the poems you just read. The creation story of the last poem, the allegory, the satire, the incantation. And I think I was wondering, you've spoken a lot about when you started writing and coming up as a poet in the 60s, that your models and your colleagues and your peers were the artists. They were the visual artists. They weren't the poets. They were people like Robert Rauschenberg and Warhol and Jasper Johns. So where did you actually find your literary models for your work for? What kind of textual sources or oral creation stories or oral traditions did you start using to figure out the kind of forms you wanted to write your poems in?
Well, I'm a poet since I was 14 years old, and then I went to Columbia. We went to Columbia University, Columbia College, and I studied everything. You study kids in school. You study all of poetry traditions and all literature traditions. And so, what we inherited, besides the ancient and the older 20th century, was the modernism of John Ashbery and Frank O'Hara, and the lyrical poetry of Allen Ginsberg and the Beats. So that's what one got given immediately, and I loved it all, But it wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be a modernist. I didn't want to write like John Ashbery, and I didn't want to write like Allen Ginsberg either. And so, not to digress, but they were all gay, and I was gay. And they were no more interested, like Frank O'Hara and John, will interest me as a gay man, but my poetry was off their radar. And Allen Ginsberg, the same. I didn't write like him, so I wasn't the gay boy that he would like, So I'm saying this because the poets were no help. At the same time, I met all these artists in 61 and 62, and I just saw what every of them did, and they loved my work. And not only that, I loved their work, and I saw them on a daily basis. And it was those years, starting in 60, I actually stopped writing poetry in 60, I think, or 61. And a year and a half later, I started again. And seeing Andy Warhol on a daily basis, every single day, what he did, what he didn't do, and all the rest of them. And the years before and after Bob and Jasper, and the pop artists. And to see what I studied found image. I studied in school, art, history, so I knew Duchamp and Dada and all of that, and the Russians and the Italians, but that was not the influence. The influence was these guys doing it. And I said, if they can do that for painting, I can do it for poetry. It was that moment. Nobody had used found images in our modern time. Mm-hmm. So that's what gave rise to those first early found poems. Mm-hmm. And then I went on for 15 years doing this. They evolved, as you probably, and then I stopped. So that was my first voice, was creating a voice with found images.
Okay. And when you stopped and you started moving into a different kind of writing and a different kind of poetic practice, I guess this was another question I had coming off of your reading just here and in a few other things I've seen of yours. Do you write for the page or the canvas, as it were, or do you write for performance? Do you write for the ear or for visually what it looks like? Or is that like kind of a distinguishing factor you don't make?
Well, I don't. I write from my heart. I mean, I write those things just come to mind. They don't come all of a sudden. Like the last poem, different parts of it, I didn't know what I was doing until it coalesced into that. And so I do it for myself. And so I'm dealing with the printed word or writing it by hand or on a computer every day, because I write prose, memoir pieces. So the printed page is enormously important to me. But as I'm writing, I say the words. Even the new poem, I say what they sound like, and I change them if they don't sound right. So the poem is meant to be a poem, first, and then second of all, the venues that's most applicable to poems in our time is performance. So, indeed, when I'm so aware of the sound when I'm writing that they're made for performance. But that's not the end. I mean, that's just one tangent. Performance. The page. I mean, if it wasn't on the page, I couldn't perform it.
Right. But it's interesting listening to you because I think there's a certain kind of poetry that works really well, that works best when you're reading it. And it has a certain kind of syntax, and the syntax is the syntax of the page and of the written word. But then there's another kind of writing that works best with the ear, and the syntax and the punctuation it's about the breath and the body, and the line breaks come where it would naturally come with the breath of the sentence. And it seems somehow, it's interesting because it seems like you're sort of working with both. When you're performing, I can kind of imagine a white page. I can imagine the white space around the words, which are, of course, it's quite important in poetry, more than in probably any other kind of text. The white space supports. It's sort of it's the negative of everything that is there that you've written. And at the same time, it sounds very song-like. It sounds very much more like an oral tradition that has this incantation or incantatory quality that like Ginsberg and so forth also had. So yeah, I'm interested in this kind of movement back and forth, I guess, between performance and writing, because I think this is also a question that's come up a lot more recently in the contemporary art world, since literature is sort of moving into those veins. I mean, I think it has before in the 60s and 70s, and we're in another moment where it's sort of coming back and being used as like a visual art practice. So.
Well, see, I see it sort of differently. I don't see it as different things. I think of myself or anybody who does this as a poet. So that's where I am, a poet. And being a poet, you work on different skills. And how you make the poem is a skill. I mean, that's a skill. And then performance is a completely different skill. I mean, performance to poetry is like a different skill. Like ballet is to poetry. And so as a poet, you develop skills in performing, and you make your decisions. Like I don't know how to sing, so I made a decision long ago not to be singer, get a band and do that kind of thing, because I don't know how to sing, and I don't know how to do that. But I developed over 50 years a skill of performing. That basically has nothing to do with poetry. And that's one part of my life. And then another thing is art. I've been doing art since the 1960s. I went to art school quite early, but I sort of wanted to be a poet rather than an artist. So I've been making silkscreen things from 1968 to today. And that's a completely but I only use my words, if you've seen. Words from the poems, done. That's the connection. Words from my poems, and they are the paintings. And inside of that, in the passing of all these years, I've had to develop skills in those different forms, like skills at water. I've had many shows recently, the last 5 years, of watercolors, all different. So watercolors is a skill. I had to develop that skill. It's like performing. It's a skill, watercolor. Drawings on paper. In Paris, New York, I have these shows of things, like drawings on paper and big silkscreen paintings. And each of those things, to figure out, to make silkscreen work, in the art world, these things now sell for a lot of money, and it's even to penetrate the art world is a skill in itself. So those two things, like performing, is being a poet. I've developed the skills of performing. I don't think of it separate. It's so inherent in the poem, and then the visual. Any of the visual shows that become installations are the same thing. I mean, just as an extension of me being a poet. And then there's endless areas and all that. I did 50 LP albums, Giorno Poetry. I thought of those because of the album covers in the collection was a work of art in itself. I mean, because I started in the middle 60s. So that's a separate thing of being a poet and functioning as a producer, or call it a producer, or making art objects out of what you produce. And so And there's many more things, the different skills of video and performing for film and all those other things. So my thing is that it's not, the thing the word is often used, crossover, and a poet goes into, or poetry or literature goes into the art world. That's true too. But in my case, it's not true, because it's just a poet manifesting in these different...
Yeah, because language seems to be at the root of each of these different kinds of works.
Yes, exactly. And skills that you have to develop in each, which any poet has to do, even if you're quite an academic conservative poet. You have infinite skills inside of that,
Right. But it's interesting because also those poems that you just read, I think almost every single one of them ended with a line or the penultimate line that mentioned the word mind. And this idea.
I'm a Buddhist, and I can't help it.
Yeah, and I'm interested in that because language is the sort of medium of thinking of the mind, and I was wondering too when I was listening to you, because I know you've been a Tibetan Buddhist for a long time, and do you think of, and you have a meditation practice, do you think of meditation as a kind of performance, and what do you think there's a relationship between this kind of meditation and the kind of work that you do and the kind of language that you use?
Well, of course, and effect, but I mean, meditation is just meditation. It is really training your mind, training your mind through meditation. And I think everybody has to do it, me as a Tibetan Buddhist, but if you don't, or anybody in this room who doesn't do it, maybe can understand a problem or why one suffers, So meditation is just meditation in any tradition. And then it affects my work. It has affected my work, what I've learned, or what has come out of my meditation, which is coming out of my mind.
But what is it training your mind for?
It's training your mind so you're not ravaged by your feelings, like why you're not unhappy, why I'm not unhappy all the time, every second of the day, because anger and desire and all these things, you get control of the mind, so you can see. It's in meditation. You see the empty nature, or you work with your life in a way that's training the mind. So the meditation, even though it's maybe has to do with mantra and this and visualization or not, watching the breath, whatever it is, the effect of that is training the mind. And the same in other traditions.
Did you see when you started meditating and you became a serious Buddhist, did you see a change in your writing, in your poetry? Did your practice change at the same time?
Because I think those years of the found poetry, where I moved from simple found to collage, the making collage more lineal poems, it was so continuous. I worked on it every year, and it changed every year. That it was concurrent with my Buddhist practice, so it changed. Being a meditator, you don't get enlightened in a month or anything. You don't even train your mind in 10 years. So it's a long process that if you're lucky, works, or works to some degree. And so the work was gradually changed, I would think. Until one point, I did everything I could to finish the found thing. I did every possible change I could on every year for 15 years or more, 18 years. And then I stopped, and then just let the found images were in my mind like these. So it's that kind of evolution.
Do you think of, so I guess I have a question about what triggered this change from using appropriated language to simply employing your own? And then I guess my second question is, do you consider the kind of writing that you do now as you just suggested, as another kind of appropriation? That even though the language is simply coming from yourself. It's similar,
because I use the similar technique of when I made collages of found images, the same as I made collages of these kind of images.
But you're not pulling it from a newspaper or from an outside source.
Yeah, it became too much trouble. But the thing is, nobody realizes I took it very seriously. So every poem changed. Like you just figure out every time you do something, you did one thing a little better, whatever it was. And you sort of try to figure out what that was, and the next time develop that, and taking everything forward for years and years. And finally, at one point, the reason I said I had done everything I could ever possibly dream of doing with a found image. And also it's concurrent with something else which is something else now. So starting in '65, I started making sound compositions with electronics, with being introduced by William Burroughs and Brian Geisler and all that. And then I worked with Bob Rauschenberg at 9 Evenings of Art and Technology, and was with him, and I met Bob Moog. So there's a whole thing from from 65 to 80, where I did every year a sound composition with on these enormously complicated things, these 24-track tape recorders using my words, and it went on. And every year those changed. I mean, I'm working with great engineers, Bob Bilecki in New York. So every year I would figure out what we did, and we would take it another step in a composition. It was a musical. It's making music out of words, essentially what it was. And I did that for 8 years, and at the same time, I stopped the found images of that completely, and started doing this later phase. But it was more like having done everything I could possibly think of doing with these two forms. And happily, I went on to do something else, and some people don't. So.
What do you think of at the moment? I think somehow many of the projects you did, like that is downstairs, the Dial-A-Poem project, we should probably talk about that a little bit. But in some ways, it was sort of seeing into the future, sort of predating this idea also of digital technology and the way that poetics and poetic writing and language in general has sort of been changed by the way in which we live many of our lives on these sort of social platforms or through digital writing or this kind of circulation and reception that was simply not possible before. So what do you think of, I guess, kind of this idea of digital poetics at this moment, and it's sort of tied to conceptual writing? I mean, there are people like Kenneth Goldsmith who are, proponents of this kind of appropriated writing, and this.
Well, anybody can do whatever. All of that. It's
But it's interesting because it's sort of it's kind of
the
opposite.
When I started the things in the '60s, it was sort of it's the wrong thing. Pop art had this enormous effect, But when you were there, it was the energy of doing it, because everybody was different. It wasn't that one style influenced you. And then with Bob Rauschenberg, it was before Bob, because in the early '60s, it was a teeny group of people. So I also knew quite well Steve Reich and Max Neuhaus. And Phil Glass, I knew from school even, and a lot of them were working with tapes, So I said, well, this is '62 or '4, that you take a tape and you, like Max Neuhaus did, you put a few words and then you repeat it on it, really primitive. But that's how I sort of got the taste of it. Then Bob Rauschenberg at 9 Evenings, you get introduced to these engineers. So Dial-A-Poem and all of the electronics just rose intuitively at the moment. I mean, that was the moment, And so I was lucky enough to catch a little of it and but I didn't grow up in it. I got to it early, and not to digress, but the problem with Bob Rauschenberg 9 Evening of Art and Technology, it was older artists using technology, and they didn't grow up with this tech. So as great as John Cage or Lucinda Childs, she didn't know technology, so the pieces were great, but they weren't. So Bob Rauschenberg thing was a breakthrough, but any one of the pieces, they were just really brilliant artists doing brilliant art. So, but I sort of got the wave. Like I was just, not that I guess, but I was thinking last week on the internet, I read something that 2-year-old babies should not be allowed to see the iPad more than 1 hour a day. And I said to myself, these babies are the ones who are going to understand how to work with whatever generation that is 25 years from now, And that's, I'm completely out of it, long out of it.
Yeah.
But so.
Yeah. It's interesting. I guess I kind of wanted to maybe go back to, because you also keep going back to this sort of very pivotal moment in your life in the '60s and meeting Bob Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns and their influence on you and so forth. And I guess I was interested too, as we sort of spoke about before we came up here, this idea of class and a kind of class consciousness and a kind of post-war American idea that also somehow either influenced you or infused your body of work. I guess I'm thinking about Warhol and many of these artists who were using new technologies that were being marketed towards like a kind of general audience, and there was a kind of class consciousness embedded in that. And I was wondering if you feel like that's somehow relevant to your work or to the beginnings of your work.
No, because I never saw it as that in itself as class consciousness. Because something, I come from an Italian-American middle-class, upper-middle-class Italian-American, so I came from that. So for me, not to digress, but I have a sort of a really good beginning in that my mother was a famous fashion designer and made a bit of money. And so I got an allowance when I went to college, like we all do. Except she continued after I finished, because I wanted to be a poet. It was this naive generation of the 1940s and 50s that they believed their son could become president. You know, that night, you know, the children of immigrants who believed the children could become president. So I got this allowance to be a poet. But it created a little, that I didn't have to worry about rents where everything was very cheap. But I made I made money all the time, but I had something that paid the bills every day. It was very minor, it was just $200 a month, but it was this thing that I didn't have to worry or do something horrible like become a teacher, you know, and suddenly every day I'm going to a school and so it allowed me. So this was completely, it was just a purity. We never thought about class, and I become more sensitive to it later. But I never thought of myself as Italian American anything. Just as I never thought of Andy Warhol as Czech or Slovakian American, or it turned out Slovakian American. It was just us doing it, or Frank Steller as anything, or I mean, the most Bob Rauschenberg had was a bit of white trash, but that was sort of a cultural. And it was later that I became. It was more the end of the '60s and the '70s. I became politically radicalized for other reasons, but so.
Yeah. Well, I guess that brings me to another question. We were talking earlier too about your sort of constant travel schedule and how you've been spending, because of your partner, you've been spending quite a bit of time in Switzerland the past 17 years, and also just constantly traveling for your performance and for your work in Europe. And it's interesting because your medium is language, and your medium is the English language. And so you're often performing for audiences where English isn't their native language. Yeah. And so language takes on a different kind of quality. It's not just about content or kind of direct translation or meaning. It has a kind of material quality. It has a kind of sonic quality. It has to somehow do a different kind of work than the way in which we often use language. And I'm kind of interested in asking you about that.
I just do it the same all the time, but sort of in Italy it becomes Italian opera. You know, they don't understand just the way I don't understand Italian opera, you know. Or so in my case, it transcends, because a lot of people know a little bit English in these countries, or enough to be able to get it. But in a certain sense, it can be like opera. The energy produced in the sound of the words, it's not my problem, but it's performance.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever think about, I mean, I think for me, as an American who's lived in for Europe for quite a few years now, and I'm often doing performances or readings for audiences where English isn't the first language, and I've become aware of that, and I enunciate in a different way. And I think sometimes when I'm writing for performance, I write in a different way. I use this, I think in the art world, there's this kind of term, international English, I think also in the business world, where it's a kind of English that can kind of transcend borders because of its simplicity, because of, for many reasons. And I think that's actually, that's an interesting change in language, but none of these things sort of affect you when you're writing? I mean,
well, no, because I'm aware of what happens when you use a microphone, how you have to pause and have to use your voice in a certain way, and how you develop skills about going on a downbeat. So I'm very aware of it because of the microphone.
Right.
And it all boils down to one thing, and I was thinking about it recently. It's sort of the genesis of me even being a poet is because people like for instance, in 1963, I went to listen to John Ashbery just returned from Paris, and so Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, and Kensco gave the first time in the history of the game, we were reading together. It was packed, it was packed. And Andy and I were sitting on the floor back there. We couldn't even hear it, and because it profoundly said, "Why is it so boring? Why is it so boring?" And I got furious. Why is it so? That propelled me for the rest of my life. To this day, when people the endless people say poetry is dead. Poetry is dead. Nobody buys magazines. Nobody goes to poetry readings. But to me, poetry is more alive than it has ever been, for a number of reasons. In the 19th century, they printed 100 copies of Baudelaire's thing, And if you go to the 18th century, a few aristocrats, etc. And in the last 50 years, with everything, it's a golden age. And so people that say poetry is dead are just poets who have failed, in my mind. And there's countless poets who have failed, and that's why endless people it's the poets who say poetry is dead. Nobody else says it's dead, it's the poets. And the bottom line for me is that you can't kill poetry. I mean, every single baby that's born has the potential of being a poet. And if that baby has enough skills, it's a poet, To invent poetry, it's primordial. It isn't like you can't kill the human race. You can't kill poets for being born. I mean, you may kill literary traditions. A modernism in lyrical poetry may go, or that poetry of earlier modernism may go. That's boring. Let it die. But you can't. People who complain about it being dead have just failed. Poetry, you can. So that's been the genesis of my entire life. Whatever my intuition that led me to dial a poem or to do anything I've done is the idea that it's just intuition taking me to selling that leads me to do these things.
Are you still interested in works like Dial-A-Poem, using sort of new technologies to reach wider audiences with the work? Is that still something that's interesting to you?
Not at all. I mean, I guess I stopped that whenever it was in the 70s or 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a little thing like now, those phones, rather than, we did Dial-A-Poem at Museum of Modern Art in New York, 2 years ago. So it was a lot, when it was live, it was on the telephones, but the telephones downstairs, the computer was in the telephone, so we don't have to bother connecting. So that all of those kind of things fascinating.
Yeah.
But it's not me doing it. It's in this case, Bob Bilecki, my engineer, brilliant engineer who does.
Yeah, but it's interesting because in one of your poems just now, I think it was your last one, you said something about no nostalgia. I have no nostalgia, and but it was interesting being downstairs. And many of you guys, if you hadn't you should go to the cafe and do the Dial-A-Poem. It's really it's beautiful. But you pick up this old time receiver and you put it against and it's like a different kind of talking or listening, just the weight of it. And then also hearing the intimacy of these poets, most of whom were from the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Or the 70s.
But, Dial-A-Poem was on then, and you could call from Oslo. So that was literally the telephone. Your mother and father, or whoever was there, your grandparents, or what, would listen to a phone like that. We're listening to Dial-A-Poem in '68.
Yeah.
On.
But do you feel like by having these new installations, and I'm not against them all, I think it's wonderful, but do you feel like there's a bit of nostalgia in that, a nostalgia for a kind of certain period of time in the poetry world?
No, because nostalgia implies longing for something, and often I get asked to do things, and then I have to do it. So with Dial-A-Poem, I had to reinvent it because we had thousands and thousands of selections because it was on for so many years, and I had to pick 200. It was the last thing I wanted to do: listen to every single one and pick the one. I mean, some of them I knew automatically that I would choose, but I had to do it, which was really. It was a job, and so. But then on the other hand, it was really interesting that something that was ancient in my life, I was able to bring to current now. I mean, that was because nostalgia wasn't there, so I got recreated. That's why I don't have nostalgia. My life's sort of recreated now with everything I do.
Yeah. I guess, before we end, I'm kind of interested because you've somehow been working for, almost 60 years in the visual art world as a poet, as someone whose main medium is language, whether it's on paintings and being performances or in books. And how do you think that's affected in a larger way the way that you use language, the way that you think about poetry, the way you think of the potential of literature itself? Always doing it within the context of the art
that's a personal choice, because I withdrew from the various poetry world. I mean, but it was all sort of complicated in a sense. I lived with William Burroughs for 20 years, so we have this life of touring endlessly. But I there's only certain kinds of poetry that strike me, and there's not much of it, So poetry most other poetry, very few interests me, So I don't hang out with poets so much. I have a lover who's an artist, so I'm in the art world. And so I'm in the art world because essentially I was rejected by the poetry world. It was not my problem. I mean, I was propelled out of it into a world that I can function in. And the reason I've said many times, I don't want to write like Mark Strand. I don't want to write like John Ashbery. I don't want to write like Frank O'Hara. And I do not want to write like Allen Ginsberg, even though I've used all of them in my work. And not used it intentionally. Whatever somehow intuitively I absorb comes out, from the beats and from all of it. And so, that's a tough nut with the poet to tell the poetry world that. So maybe I've taken refuge in the art world, and it allowed me to be free because I consider myself a poet. I do visual art like I perform, but it's being a poet I do these, as I said before.
Well, as a writer, I just want to know, who do you read? Who did you read in the 60s? Who do you read now? Who are the?
I'm not reading a book now, actually.
No?
I've been doing a bunch of research about the Crusades. A lot of the everyday life in the 11th and 12th century for the last couple of years, because I'm writing a piece about that. So,
Okay.
and historical things more interest me. I don't want to waste my time reading a novel. I mean, because I read every novel that was written up until whatever year that was, in the 60s or 70s,
Yeah.
but that's just my personal thing that.
But are there certain writers? I mean, because it's interesting because you always bring up the artists who have been your friends and your colleagues and the people who inspire you. But are there certain writers, old writers, contemporary writers, who you always look to again and again, or you pick up their books every once in a while? No, they're not.
I mean, like William Burroughs was an enormous influence because we essentially lived together not together all the time, but for 35 years or something like that. And his mind was a writer's mind, and he was so brilliant. He was, like I said in my book, his mind was more brilliant than you could ever imagine. So it gets through to the books, but it was so dazzling. And I'm sure, I was trained by that mind also. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure, I don't have any others that come to mind right now, but...
Okay, yeah. All right, well, is there anything else you want to sort of...
No. Does everybody have any more questions?
Are there any questions from the audience?
You were talking about art and technology, and you had a relationship with technology, and I think you said the 80s. And people now say that... art and technology is already happening. Video games is the art of the future, and people who make video games are artists, even though they're thought of as people in the employ of commerce. What do you think of rap? Do you think rap is the future of poetry? Is rap a live form of poetry that's invaded music, or?
Well, rap is a poetic form. And a really important one, since so many people are involved in it. And I don't know so much about it, but I have enormous respect, because inside of this huge thing that is rap, I'm sure because I don't listen to it all. I mean, I don't know the name. I'm sure there are great rappers that are so refined in what they do. Like whoever has, like rock and roll, all those rock stars, they have certain skills. Whoever their names are, have skills in these rap. So it's a hugely important poetic form. And happily has this gigantic following of people, But it's just one thing,
It's too formulaic, yeah. Too formulaic.
And one is happy that it exists because it's dealing with words, or hip-hop. They're dealing with words and repetition. And it doesn't matter that most of it's bad, because in poetry, from the beginning of time, most poetry has been bad. I mean, the great poets we think of, they were the ones that came out of whatever generation or period. Can you imagine all the rest? How bad it was? And it's still true today. And now the more people do it, I mean, more people think of themselves as, I hope, as poets or whatever, the more bad poetry. Yeah. Because now you can, not so, but sort of the internet, where there's sort of this exchange that's beyond belief.
Yeah.
Lots of people think they are poets.
Yeah. But I think also hip-hop has been, and pop music in general, has been enormously influential on the new generations of poets, younger generations of poets who are coming up now. In some ways, maybe the way that rock music and minimal music to some degree was very influential on poets in the 60s and 70s and so forth. I think the kind of syntactical work that hip-hop artists do, and just sort of like pop language in general, is very influential and is somehow, embodied in a lot of like young poets' writing. And it's quite interesting.
And I think over the last 50 years, many young poets, when they were 12 or 10, get given a guitar for Christmas, and their interest was words. And then they have this thing, and they fiddle with it, and they go on. I mean, the millions of kids got that, and they're all bad poets and musicians. But out of that comes Tom Waits, or comes out of any one of those people, or Cabaret Voltaire, or countless. You don't even know where the line is drawn, because it's so easy. If you have some skill with the voice and words, it's so easy to have a rock band. So you don't know where the line, where these folks, and then there are obvious ones like Patti Smith and Jim Carroll, and who have made this decision. I never did, because as I said, I don't know how to sing. And Patti Smith, like a story Patti says once, that she was at a poetry reading, and this young girl came up to her and said, "Patti, I'm a poet, what should I do?" And she said, "Well, get yourself a band, because if you want an audience more than 20 people, you get yourself a band." and she became Cat Power. What
Really?
Jan Marshall?
That was
Cat
Jan
Power.
Marshall?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And so who knows how many other Jan
Amazing.
Marshalls where only sort of, I mean this kindly in a sense, is that more sort of people who are conservative by nature, like even me, who decided to just be poets rather than, because it's hard to be a poet. I mean, I was just lucky because I produce so many things, I've always made money. But more often than that, you have to get a job teaching, which is, I hate to say this because people, but to me that's the death of an artist or a poet. I mean, to teach a little bit is okay, but to have to do it for 20 years is, no.
Yeah. He's interested in the idea of performativity and performance and how it relates to everyday life. So your sort of maybe your daily practice, but also the kind of blurring between everyday life and your artwork and your poetry.
Well, I just, in everyday life, there are two things. Like when I have this new poem, when I rehearse it, but then when I got finished, I rehearse every day. You know, I don't like rehearsing. Yeah. But I rehearse every day for only a half hour, every day. And sometimes if I'm bringing back, I perform lunch, I bring back old poems and I rehearse every day. I never like doing it. I have to force me, and I do it early. So because if I put it off, I don't do it. And it's an important point, you know. Poets perform, even if you're sort of a poet who doesn't consider himself a poet. You get up in front of an audience and read this book. That's performance, and they do it over and over again. And poets are generally, often, the worst performers, because in all the other traditions, people rehearse. If you're an actor, you rehearse. If you're a musician, you rehearse. If you're a dancer, you rehearse. If you're any kind of a singer, opera singer or a rock and roller, you rehearse. You do this boring thing. Poets, it's not even in their vernacular. I mean, maybe a day or two before, they read what they're going to read. But that's completely different than reconceiving it as void. I mean, not that the book is bad. The book is something else. But the idea, if poets treated it as something realer than just sort of a throwaway, that my words on the pages are more, and I don't have to bother with this other stuff. Mm. But now, see, there's no rules. If a poet just wants to do that, there's nothing wrong. If a poet doesn't want to rehearse, it's totally okay. But I'm just saying what I did in my sort of doing. So my everyday life has to do with writing, memoirs, or working on these and rehearsing, and then I interrupt all of this. I have another second loft below my one where I am in, and I go to, after 2 hours, I go downstairs and work on either whatever I'm working on, paintings or drawings or watercolors, for 2 hours, and then go upstairs and then and not because it's a different part of the brain, you know. Like when you're working on painting, it's not about. And then I go upstairs and continue. I'm maybe not working on the poem, but the memoir. And then, so I go back. That's how my everyday life works, doing all these different things. And then, you know, emails and shows and all these things are part of all this thing that we do every day.
More like this idea, like say even like Alan Caprow, or the living
that
speaker.
kind of performative thing, that word. Well, yes, I mean, it was an enormous influence. It's just that, I mean, the energy was what was real. Because I went to the Judson. It happened once a week, I think. So I went almost every week to the Judson Dance Theater. And the energy was just, that's what changed my life, that energy. Carolee Schneemann with Fish, Meat Joy, or whatever, and all of them. Freddie Herco and whatever. But nothing has changed. I mean, like now, there's the same thing that happened in all around the world. There's all these sort of people do all this great work, and you just have to, and I don't think that now is very different than it was in the 60s. There's a zillion great artists and do great art, and it's this amazing, the art world. And the poetry world is still as pathetic as it was.
Oh, you're a bit too hard on it. Come on.
Well, yeah, I know. But so all those things, I mean, they just were a part of one's life. The one went and saw Yvonne Rainer, and then I'm not sure what one took home. Not a dance, but just her brilliance, and I'm not sure how it affected, but it affected all of our lives, you know. But just like today, I'm sure, because artists and dancers, they see each other. They're kind of, you know, particularly painters, or they're constantly seeing what each other do, and they have this impact, yes.
I probably have a bit of a related question, and although we've had so many conversations before, Quinn brought up the question of the found image before, and I think you kind of just brushed it, and then you didn't talk a bit, you didn't talk longer about it. And I was wondering, where exactly did you find your found images? I think you asked, did you find them in newspapers? And I kind of think, was it observations, things you saw in the streets of New York in the 1960s. So what kind of found images were there? Where
Well, the found images, the first one I did was sort of 1961, before I met Andy, or beginning of 62. And I thought about it endlessly. And then I said, why, I can do this. But I mean, again, it wasn't something, even though I knew where it came from, it was more like mirroring something that was happening in the art world. So it was, it took me weeks or months, and it was out of the New York Times, sort of little, almost like a National Geographic kind of report thing, that you could break the sentence and it had and any of these images, one sentence, any one found sentence, if it's the right sentence, is a drama. It has a beginning, middle, and end. The fat lady singing even, and everything. And then the second one, strangely enough, was Fred Herko, who died. The star of Andy Warhol's Haircut and Roller Skate, and he was a dancer, a Judson dance theater person who I knew quite well, and he had become a speed freak, and he felt that he had destroyed his dancer's body, and with Mozart's Coronation Dance, he jumped out of a building. And when I was with Andy, so I wrote a piece. I wrote a piece about that later, but I used that from the Village Voice. Again, that was barely 8 words, or the obituary, or 10 words, or whatever. But it told everything. There was recently in New York at Judson Church, the 50th anniversary of Fred Herko's suicide on October 27th, I think it was, that I performed this piece in.
It's amazing, actually, how these things become sort of start out as these sort of experiments. Of course, yeah, it comes from Dada and so forth, but still, it was still very fresh when you guys were doing it in the 60s as well. But how it becomes instrumentalized so quickly, or maybe not quickly, but I think 2 weeks ago in the New York Times, they had a section in the arts pages where they asked maybe 10 writers and poets. They gave them a text from the New York Times, and then they did basically, they would black out words and create their own poem out of the text. And it was actually in the pages of the New York Times, commissioned by them, using their own material, because it's become such a sort of common practice among poets.
And that's one of the reasons I probably stopped. But it hadn't been so used when I stopped in '79 or whatever. It wasn't so used, but I had already gotten to think that it was too. And then immediately, sort of even earlier than that, I had a book of poems published in France, Suicide Sutra, Christian Bourgois, and it was endemic. Everybody became a found poet over there. Starting in '64, it just became, what did I do? And I think most of them are horrible. And I'm all, and they think, because, so I should keep my mouth shut, but I think of that as a dismal part of my work. I don't. But anyway, it was treating the image so carefully that it was you have no idea how painful it was, so to speak, or being able to take that a step further and choose another image. Because I was, one of the sort of, again, it's talking about old people, one of the interesting things about knowing all these famous people like Bob Rauschenberg, Jasper, and Andy was not anything I learned, but why they chose this glass rather than that, or this piece of paper. It's inconceivable why they made those decisions. But somehow that was a teaching, and I took that into my work, not knowing why or how I was doing, but choosing these images as they evolved over the years. I spent every day I worked for hours on these things.
Do you think it gave you, by having so many of your colleagues and your friends and your peers being visual artists who weren't working with language, do you think it gave you a kind of necessary space or privacy or autonomy to then work with your language and work with your poetry, to be able to use them as sort of models in their practice? But because they weren't working with language per se, or all of them, it gave you a kind of room to do what you wanted to do.
I could do anything I wanted to and not feel, I never thought of this, but I couldn't feel alone, because they were doing what was ever on their minds, and I could do whatever. At the same time, I was very much a part of a literary world, like St. Mark's Church and all of that world, because I performed all the time there. So all of those things, people who were called the second generation New York School, and were like Andre Codesco, anybody who was there, were my friend. We performed together all the time. And I just did what I did, and they did what they did. Some were really great, and some. So it wasn't as though I was completely out of any of those worlds, Or it was in a Buddhist world also, took up a bit of time.
But it seems like recently that second generation, people like Bernadette Mayer and Anne Waldman and Louis Warsh and so forth, these kind of people who were sort of very instrumental in in the art world, but working as poets, as language, are being kind of like retaken up and rediscovered in the past 5 or 10 years, and taken more seriously in the more mainstream
Yes,
poetry
yes,
world,
yes,
which
yeah.
is actually really exceptional.
Really great, yes.
Yeah.
indeed.
So, is there a last question from the audience?
Oh, that's good.
No? Okay, well, I just want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having
It was
me, and thank you
wonderful.
for doing
Yeah.
this with me. It was really
It's
nice.
really great.
Good, yeah.
And yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thanks for coming.